Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about the idea of a distributed cloud service where a cloud deployment is no longer restricted by location choices, data sovereignty, data residency, or here's a big one, data latency. To discuss that, I'm joined by Leung, Vice President, Products and Strategy at Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. Leo, absolutely thrilled to have you with us today.
It's great to be here, James. Thanks for having me.
Sure. All right, Leo, I would like to get the inside scoop from you. As you talk with cloud customers, what are they most asking for? Is it a question of price? Are they really focused on compliance and security? What are the clients talking about these days?
Sure. There's a few kind of prevailing themes. As you know, the cloud market is actually pretty mature at this point, the cloud infrastructure market. We've been at this for 15 years.
Hmm.
So I think increasingly customers are looking and saying, well, there's different providers that have different strengths. I really want to take advantage of the best of breed services that are available, right?
Hmm.
Regardless of whether it's in a single provider, and actually it'd be better if it were across providers.
Hmm.
Secondly, I do think that data residency and where data is mattering more and more, both for kind of regulatory reasons. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of world news around how things are changing around the world.
Hmm.
And more companies, organizations, and governments are really having to factor this into how they think about technology and IT and being able to get the cloud where they need it. So I think combination of those things, being able to get the cloud services they need to solve their problem. And then secondly, really thinking a lot more about where those services are going to be, where the data is going to be.
Well, that brings up an interesting point in that you talk about where it's going to be, and you use the phrase cross provider. So really, of course, we're living in a multi-cloud world. Are you sensing that the clients, the various companies that buy the cloud are confused and somewhat really challenged by the multi-cloud deployment, or are they handling that better than we might think?
Well, I think that depending on which analyst you look at, all of them will say something like between 60 and 70% of customers are already multi-cloud
Hmm.
in that they're using multiple providers. But in most cases, they're just using them separately for different types of use cases.
Right.
So I think it's very common that customers are already there with multiple providers.
Hmm.
I think where the market is evolving is, well, how do I use those things in a more seamless way together? Um, how do I mix and match best of breed like I used to on-prem, where that was the mode of operation, right? People would buy equipment, they'd install the software from the vendor they needed to go solve a problem, and it would be very heterogeneous, right? It was not an issue. That was best practice. Um, what's happened in the cloud is that, there's been a bunch of walled gardens that have existed between the providers, and that's been the case to date. I think we're moving to a point where uh, customers are going to want the providers to work together to provide better solutions.
I want to get on the topic of distributed cloud, but the one last thing before I move on. You mentioned the walled garden. I think it has felt very true to me. I'm wondering if your sense that the providers themselves are realizing, hey, we need to get away from that walled garden approach and admit that it is a multi-cloud world, or are they still, for competitive purposes, still trying to work that walled garden angle?
Yeah. It's funny how many of my peers I see on flights between the Bay Area and Seattle. Um, I think there's a recognition that yes, ultimately customers want choice. I think we've come to market sooner than others with, for example, Microsoft, to go and try to tackle that issue head on and work directly with Microsoft and Microsoft Azure to make it easier for customers to use both of our technologies.
Mhm. All right, let's talk about distributed cloud. I mean, why is distributed cloud called the next evolution of cloud? What problems does it solve?
Yeah, I think it's a great kind of concept and moniker for the idea that customers should be able to get cloud services where they need it in a way that's not limited by the public cloud regions that exist, right? So if you look at our various public cloud maps, Largely, it's concentrated in a set of countries. And everybody else, right? Let's say there's 175 countries. Everybody else has to go to those countries to get the services with varying degrees of latency. So the idea behind distributed cloud is, well, what if you could actually get uh, some or all of those cloud services in whatever location you chose, right?
Hmm.
Where the services came to you, right? And you could deploy them, for example, in a specific country, in a specific data center, but still get the benefits of the cloud you were looking for in terms of, yes, a provider like Oracle is actually managing the hardware, right? Making sure the software is up to date, patched, secured, et cetera, and making sure it's available. What if you could get all that together? And the funny thing is, you and I have been in the market. People used to call it private cloud, right? Or maybe
Right.
they still do,
Right.
where, hey, I can get all the benefits of the cloud, but I can locate it where I chose. The problem with what's been in the market to date is that there's been a lot of promises around that, but largely it still required the customer to do a lot of work, right? Buy the hardware, install the software, figure out how to keep it up to date, all that kind of stuff. So I don't think that promise really came true.
Well, let me make sure I understand the idea fully. Say there's a hypothetical company, it's based in Chicago, and they need cloud services. I think the other cloud providers would say, well, we've got cloud outlets, cloud facilities not that far from you that you can tap into. They're close enough. You're going to have great service. I know Azure, of course, even has the Azure Stack that claims to put a hardware appliance in the data center. I mean, what's different from the Oracle the Oracle solution that's not happening with the other cloud players?
Sure, sure. So the US is interesting because the US is pretty well covered by public cloud regions.
Okay.
But even in the case of the US, there are entities in the federal government, right? Military contractors, large financial institutions, and telcos that actually want additional choice of location, and they want to host cloud services in that specific location, either because uh, uh, for performance reasons, to be close to other things they have,
Mhm.
or to have data residency. Um, there's less of an issue in the US around data residency, although I've also heard customers talk about the fact that, well, sometimes they want data not to even leave a particular state.
Mhm.
Um, let's talk about a different example for a second. Vodafone
Mhm.
in the UK, right?
Mhm.
So still one of the largest telcos in the world. They recently announced that they purchased something called OCI Dedicated Region from
Mm.
us,
Okay.
which is a unique offering that we announced a couple of years ago. And we recently announced a new update to that service where uh, for a much smaller footprint, where we're able to go and provide the customer an environment in about 12 racks of equipment. We can go install all of Oracle Cloud Infrastructure wherever the customer chooses. So Vodafone, for example, is going to deploy 6 of these dedicated regions in 3 locations that they serve. They serve a large part of Western Europe when it comes to communications. And they're going to get all of the services that OCI has in the public cloud. But we're going to go and deploy the hardware, the services. We're going to manage the hardware and capacity for them. We're going to keep all the services up to date, but they get complete control over the location of those cloud services, as well as have control over not just the data location, but all the APIs, the metadata, et cetera, are all within their purview, within their premises, within their control. And that combination of things is unique in the market.
All right, then I wanted to make sure we drilled down into the OCI dedicated region solution. That's really what it is then. It's the idea of going to the customer with hardware and software solutions and allowing them to place it wherever they want. Is that really the core of the OCI concept?
Yeah,
Dedicated region concept?
taking that whole idea of a region, making it essentially a service where the customer doesn't have to think about any of that stuff uh, anymore, right? But they get that control that they're looking for, right? The location, the fact that the services, again, are in their purview, in their environments. There's no tethering to a public cloud, right? So a lot of the other solutions on the market are either require, you to actually go to a public cloud region first before doing anything, right? Before even a single API is executed, you got to go to the public cloud first, and then the local hardware and service behaves. Um, Secondly, the idea of having all services, not just, compute and storage and maybe a handful of services, gives customers like Vodafone and Nomura Research Institute a lot of flexibility in terms of the types of things they can run. So it's not just for building new applications, but Vodafone, for example, is planning on moving many, many applications that already exist into this environment onto certain services, but in parallel, be able to build new services or, for example, use containers in Kubernetes to modernize some of those existing applications. So having all those things in one package is what we believe customers are looking for.
So the dedicated region solution is necessarily a hardware and software combination in the client's own facility, or is it sometimes just software?
It is a hardware and software combination because our belief is that um, having a single consumption-based model is important, right? Again, there are other providers that still require you to go and forecast and plan how much hardware you need
Mhm.
to then figure out how much software you can deploy and figure out all the forecasting that's necessary. And that's a lot of work. It also separates sort of the model of, okay, well, how am I consuming the service, right? Am I still having to do some capital expenditure in addition to paying licensing and perhaps support? No, we think it's a lot simpler actually to go combine all of these models into a pure consumption-based pricing model.
And I guess that means that Oracle techs go and maintain the hardware in the client's facility?
Yeah, so the model basically works like this. We will work with the customer to go and uh, do some of that capacity planning, some of that workload planning with them.
Mhm.
We will go install that hardware and software into the customer environment. Um, in most cases, we'll be able to do remote support of that environment. So for example, we'll be able to do software patches, do fixes remotely.
Mhm.
But yes, when it comes time for additional new hardware, right, or resizing of that environment, yes, we will go in and support the customer. And yes, if there's hardware issues, we can go handle that as well.
Mhm.
So
So
it's
I guess
truly a managed service.
I'm sorry, what's the last point?
It's truly a managed service.
So I guess the argument would be that the level of performance would not be possible without the hardware resident in the client's own facility. There's no way to do that with just software alone. Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah, I mean the main benefit is that we take some of the separate concerns and we manage it for the customer, right? So
Mhm.
we can, for example, if the customer is doing a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence, well, there's probably some different hardware they're going to need, for example, GPUs, and we will go take care of that for the customer versus the customer having to do that themselves.
Uh-huh.
Um, it is possible to get good performance by installing software and hardware in your prem. That's what a lot of people do today, right? But I think the big benefit here is that we're going to take care of that whole package for the customer. So they don't have to think about it anymore. And they can truly move their resources away from doing hardware maintenance, right? Doing that type of low-level IT work and focus those resources on something else, which is what NRI, Nomura Research has told us, right? They've been able to redeploy a whole bunch of their resources to new technology development, new software development, and a lot of this heavy lifting maintenance kind of work has gone away.
I think it's just interesting if I think about this sort of as a mega trend. I'll travel in my time machine back to 2012, for example. And I remember the hype around cloud back then, and everyone said, "Oh yeah, the cloud, public cloud, is going to make all the data facilities are going to go away. It's just going to be the cloud. That's all they're going to be." And here we are in 2022, and the data center is still very much alive. I guess I wouldn't necessarily have predicted back in 2012, well, people are going to be talking about putting hardware into a client's data center. I definitely see the performance improvements. I'm not sure what my question is, just that maybe the future didn't turn out exactly how I would have expected back in 2012.
Yeah, I think largely it's there's a couple things going on. One is that while obviously I'm a huge believer in the cloud and in the public cloud, I think that we've acknowledged all along that there's going to be workloads that have to be very, very close to the customer and what they're trying to do, right?
Mhm,
Whether it's in manufacturing where they need certain technologies that are literally on the factory floor, right?
mhm,
Or they're doing very, very high frequency trading. There's certain applications that just require a level of performance, just physics needs to be there, okay? And second, we talked about this earlier, there's a more and more regulation and requirements for data to be in a certain location
mhm,
for data privacy reasons, for compliance reasons, et cetera, where those countries and those policies require data to be in a certain place and all the processing of the data to be known and in a certain place.
mhm,
So that again pushes the need for services to be located in more than just the 20 odd countries it's in today in the public
mhm,
cloud, right?
mhm,
So, so I don't think it's going to go away, right? I
mhm,
don't think that while public cloud is obviously a massive market now, there's always going to be a need for things that are local.
mhm. Interesting. I want to get your sense of where you think the future of cloud is going. But before that, is there any news you want to share with us, or maybe not at the moment?
Yeah, well, a few things. So we announced this OCI dedicated region, the enhancement of it, where uh, we initially announced it 2 years ago, and we've dramatically reduced the footprint. So it's about a quarter of the size of what it used to be, which enables more customers to get access to it and not have to have a huge data center or a huge amount of space. We've also lowered the entry price to $1 million as a starting point, which again fits in a lot of large enterprise budgets. So that's announcement number one. Two, we pre-announced something called Compute Cloud Customer. So instead of a whole data center, which is how you should think about a dedicated region, a Compute Cloud Customer is at the rack scale to provide certain services like compute and storage for example, edge locations. So a lot of telcos have dozens of smaller facilities where, again, usually it's a few racks of equipment. Um, with the Compute Cloud Customer, they can get, again, some of these managed cloud services in a location of their choosing where Oracle's doing more of the heavy lifting. So a third announcement that we've made is something we're calling Oracle Database Service for Azure. Right. So while the first two I talked about are meant to deploy cloud services in the customer premises, this third announcement really has to do with multi-cloud and furthering our partnership with Microsoft. So we started about 3 years ago where we built interconnection between our clouds. So one of the fun facts about the cloud is that we're actually oftentimes in the same city, and in some cases even in the same colo facility or even in the same building.
Hmm.
So the idea there is that by creating interconnection between ourselves, OCI and Azure, you really get rid of one of the big problems of multi-cloud, which is performance and latency, right?
Hmm.
So we started that a few years ago. We're in 11 locations around the world where we have this 2 millisecond or less connection between our clouds. This
Very low
announcement,
latency, in other words.
very low latency, exactly. And pretty much any kind of application can actually work with that kind of latency, with the exception of some of the ones we talked about earlier. Super
Mhm.
low latency has to be literally on the same physical hardware type of thing. So, so what we're announcing is really a managed service on top of that that really simplifies the experience, right? So now Azure customers will be able to very simply go into a portal that looks just like Azure, and connect the accounts. So they'll be able to connect their Azure account with their Oracle Cloud Infrastructure account. Behind the scenes, we're doing all the fancy networking to connect the clouds, connect private networks. They'll be able to then provision databases on Oracle. So things like our autonomous database or our Exadata database service that are still running on OCI.
Mhm.
And once they do that, those databases are now just like their other Azure resources.
Hmm.
So they'll be able to see them on their dashboards. They'll be able to look at the metrics and see how they're running. They'll be able to look at the logs through the Azure log portal,
Mhm.
and really, really making that user experience seamless, in addition to the underlying infrastructure high performance. So, so we're really, really excited about this announcement because we think it's going to help the thousands and thousands of Microsoft and Oracle customers that are out there, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud, be able to get a really, really good multi-cloud experience. And again, this kind of builds on the trend that we were talking about earlier around distributed cloud. Like I said, I really think customers are looking for choice when it comes to services, when it comes to provider, when it comes to location. And we're really, really excited about this announcement with
Hmm.
Microsoft.
All right. Well, I'd love to get your sense of where the cloud is going, the future of cloud and the dedicated region technology in the years ahead. So say we're in 2025 or so. What will things look like then as you see it?
Yeah, well, I think that the public cloud will continue to expand. Um, I think that a lot of countries that don't have a public cloud will have dedicated regions. So we think of our current footprint as 39 regions. We expect in a few years it'll be more like 100 or
Hmm.
even well over 100,
Wow.
because we'll be helping these customers with these dedicated regions. In, for example, Bangladesh is one of the countries.
Mhm.
Oman is another country that is running a dedicated region, so forth and so on. Um, I also see multi-cloud becoming, just ubiquitous,
Hmm.
where pretty much every customer will be using multiple clouds, and beyond just us and Microsoft, other providers will be stepping to the plate with much, much better support for
Mhm.
running across clouds in a seamless way.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's going to be a major trend. Um, I think, from a Oracle perspective and an OCI perspective, you know, each of the geographies is very different. It's pretty amazing what we're seeing in South America
Hmm.
and in Brazil,
Mhm.
where there's just huge innovation happening. And
Hmm.
it's almost like the idea that parts of Asia just skipped the whole landline thing and went right to cell. Um,
Okay.
if you look at South America, there's a lot of businesses that are just going straight to cloud um, with everything, right? All of their IT, payments, et cetera, the way they work.
Hmm.
So there's some exciting things happening in different geographies as well, in terms of how they're going to use the cloud and how they're going to take advantage of the services.
It seems that to be expected, I guess, that some of the developing markets would go to cloud faster because they might not have the existing infrastructure built out in the first place.
That's right. That's right. There's a little bit less, a little bit less existing technology and some technical debt, and just an open embrace of some of the newer technologies that are available. And
Mhm.
so anyway, I think there's some interesting geographical differences. Um, I also think, like we were talking about earlier around a dedicated region and things like data residency, certainly outside of North America and the US, tons and tons of different regulations coming into play where,
Right.
again, each of these countries is really looking to host their own cloud services, and in some cases, their own dedicated region inside of just one organization. So again, back to that distribution of the cloud everywhere.
Mhm. Leo, I think you said it. Really fascinating stuff, and it's going to be an interesting sector to follow in the years ahead. I so appreciate you sharing your insight today.
Very much. I really happy to have the conversation. Enjoyed it.